I'm with Ben Morgan from Bowerbird. Hey, Ben.
Hey Dave, how you going?
Good, thank you. So, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about, I suppose, or introduce anybody who might be watching this video briefly to Bowerbird, and then maybe a little bit about your background as well in the architecture media?
Yeah, sure. So Bowerbird is essentially it's a platform that architects and interior designers can upload their projects and share them with the media. So it's essentially at its base, it's a press kit tool, but it's also a whole lot more than that, and it's becoming a bit more like a social network just for architects, designers, and journalists. So, yep, that's what the platform does. Pretty basic.
Yep.
My background is in journalism. So I came straight out of studying journalism at university, knowing that I really didn't want to get into news journalism. I mean, look at the world now. Thank goodness
Yeah.
I didn't take that path, and went straight into it was actually interior design media, working for a publisher up in Sydney, and really never left the creative sector. So worked on websites, various sort of freelance projects, always contributing to design magazines the whole way along.
Yep.
And then, met Nick Granlease in 2014, and he had this great idea, which was Bowerbird, and hasn't the initial idea hasn't changed that much.
Yeah.
And we just ended up hanging out. We recorded this podcast ages ago that we never saw the light of day. It was about websites for architects.
Yeah.
We sort of joked that we're going to release it one day. But from there, we just got along and had this same vision, and I guess that was how many 6 years ago now. So
Yeah. So, how far has it come since then? I mean, you guys have taken it from very like small beginnings to you're kind of all over the world now, and like how many architects are you up to at the moment? Like, if we're gonna throw a count out there.
well, number within the community
Yeah, within the community. Yep.
is I mean, including architects, photographers,
Yep.
journalists. We're up to, I don't know, 3 to 5,000. I actually don't have the number.
Yeah.
I should have prepared for that.
No, but that's
Large community.
yeah,
Very,
and
very
that's
big.
interesting when you talk about it like a community, and you also mentioned that it's a bit of a social network as well. Is that
Yeah.
kind of the direction that you sort of see Bowerbird kind of trending over time a little bit?
I think that it's one of those things. I think there's very few businesses who look at architects and go, "Great, I'm going to go and make a business in architecture." It's usually someone who was an architect or has been in
Yep.
the industry in some way that sees the potential in it, because it can be challenging, and especially a few years ago, architects were really averse to the idea of marketing, which I'm sure you would
Yep.
have come across
Yep.
as well.
Definitely.
So I think community is everything when you're in this industry or in this sector. Um, and so for us, I think it couldn't have been any other way. You can't do something like Bowerbird and not have it be all about the community. I mean, the platform itself is, it's a community. It's got profiles on there. You upload projects. It is like a community.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we wouldn't be where we are if it wasn't for our community. And that started off in Melbourne.
Yep.
And really, in the early days, we had a WordPress website that was sort
Mm.
of hacked into this media kit tool,
Yep.
and I think in the first couple of months, we got sort of 30 subscribers, and most of them were friends. So
Yeah.
Nick, my co-founder, Nick
Yep.
Granlease, he is an architect turned architectural photographer. So we just both went out to all of the people that we knew and said, "Hey, do you want to sign up?" And so many of those people are still with us on that original price. So
Yep.
riding that gravy train. But
They are
it proved.
they are very happy with themselves. Let's go.
Yeah, that's right. The people who support you, you want to support them
Yep.
in
Yep.
return. So yeah, I think the fact that we grew out of a really tight knit community in Melbourne, and Melbourne is a centre for architecture. Around the world, people recognise
Mm.
Melbourne for its architecture, and Australia in general, but
Mm.
definitely Melbourne. So yeah, I think that the way that we grew is the way that we continue to grow. We go into cities that have a strong architectural presence, and we build a community. We teach architects as much as we can. So we
Yep.
we give information away for free. That's really important. You've got to give away everything that you can, everything you can afford to give away. You
Yep.
do,
Yep.
and that again, that's about reinforcing the community.
Yeah. So when you sort of you have kind of I suppose a philosophy about the architecture media and the public and architects and this relationship, and it sort of sounds like that kind of is part of almost maybe Melbourne kind of architecture culture or Australian architecture culture, that you guys are maybe exporting that to certain places, I guess. But when you go to other places, do you find that the relationship that the public and architects have is can be very, very different? Are there lots of different sort of versions of it out there, or what are you guys sort of insight into
I
that?
think because of the practice of architecture, because it's the same, fundamentally the same all around the world. You know, little bits around the edges that are different around planning and things like that. But generally, the process of architecture is so similar around the world that you can walk into a room with an architect anywhere, whether that's Israel or New York or Sydney, and you know that you're going to be able to connect around the practice of architecture. So I think that, you know, all of that's really similar. But as we've jumped around to different parts of the world, I think that it's probably that relationship between the public and architecture that is where the difference is. So I'd say in the UK, particularly London and Melbourne, we have that similarity there, and I think that the public is quite well informed around architecture or have a general understanding of the value of architecture. And then you can go to other places in the US where, you know, architects and the people who are going to be hiring them or engaging them are actually worlds apart, and they struggle a little more to connect with those clients. And, you know, that's not everywhere in the US, but then you have differences of cities. So somewhere like New York, there's not a lot of architecture that can happen on a smaller scale in a city like New York. So you're talking about a lot of interior architecture and interior design in places like that. So it definitely, you know, there's all these different little nuances, but essentially because the practice of architecture and design is the same around the world, you know, we all understand what we're talking about. So
yeah, that was really interesting what you sort of mentioned about, in contrast, some cities where you mentioned that architects and the public or their clients can be kind of worlds apart, maybe not really understanding each other, or maybe just not even really exposed to each other as much. Do you think that the media or the existence of a strong architecture media plays a really big role in that?
yeah, I mean, I think architecture media is interesting. It's this tiny little niche within a niche within a niche in so many ways. The audience is massive. So the reality of a niche nowadays, like architectural media, is, you know, huge, massive, because the world is so big. But I think that the biggest challenge really is getting into mainstream media. And you see these different publications over time, or mediums that have pushed into mainstream. So things like Grand Designs, the TV show, which obviously came out of the UK. That's probably the biggest shift in getting architecture out to the public that's ever happened. And I think because it's so much a part of the psyche now, I think people don't really give it the credit that it deserves. And I think that still is architecture's biggest challenge, is explaining what it is that architects do to the general public. And I think for us, we know that one of the keys to that is going into mainstream newspapers, national press, and actually going out there and talking directly to the clients or potential clients when they're sitting down on a Saturday, Sunday morning, looking through the newspaper. That's when you need to be connecting on that level. But you know, that obviously we're talking mainly about residential architecture there, but there's lots of other things that people don't always think of when they think of architectural publishing. So a big one would be the Open House program. So Open House Worldwide Network, all over the world, over 40 programs, I think, that run these open house weekends where basically you're opening up architecture to the public and they're getting to experience it firsthand. That's a huge thing for people to do. And it allows people to understand, the public to understand intrinsically the value of architecture by standing in a building or in a space.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So it might not even just be, you know, so say that you're in a city that maybe doesn't have, you feel like the public are maybe a little uninformed about the value of good architecture. And so some things that you can do about it would be, firstly, I guess, well, the most common thing would be, I suppose, focus on trying to get your own work to get covered in the mainstream media. Like that's obviously going to be, everyone's interested in that, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But there's also, as you mentioned, other ways that people can do it. So open houses, so events in general could be a good way to generate,
Yeah,
that
there's, I mean,
intimacy.
yeah, around the world, there's so many homes tours. It might
Yeah.
be your local institute chapter. It could be any sort of event. It may not be a pure architecture focus. It might just be an open homes tour that has all sorts of things in it. But those are the things that architects can get involved in to talk directly to their community. But I think it's really doing as much as you possibly can to get out there. I think one of the challenging things, and we have this particularly in Australia, but I expect that it's similar around the world, is that sort of newspapers, mainstream publications, it's really hard to put your hand up and find someone and get published. That sort of process is really difficult unless there's a dedicated real estate homes editor
Yep.
who understands architecture. It's really hard to do that.
Yep.
We've had some success here in Australia working with Australian community media. So they actually create content from regional architects. They will put together content and then they syndicate it throughout a whole range of regional newspapers.
Okay.
And that was something that before people would come to us and say, I want to get into my local newspaper. And it took us quite a while to sort of figure out how you knock on the door of that, because it's essentially centralized content created up in Sydney, I think, but created in one place and then distributed out. So people were going and trying to send an email to, editor at Geelong Times.
Yep. Yeah.
And that would never go anywhere because that's probably a relatively junior journalist who's been put on a regional publication who is focused on football and what's happening at the markets this weekend. So that was a realization for us, and I think it's actually a beautiful case study, that Australian community media, because they were attracted to Bowerbird because of all of the content that was there. So we had a critical mass of architects that were there with their content ready to go, and it meant that newspaper, I mean, really, it's an opportunity for the whole practice of architecture, the whole community, to compete with, less architectural content, less architectural homes content. So it might be more of a real estate approach if it wasn't for that. So, that's if you can get a group of architects together to do a task together, whether that's, homes tour or reaching out to a publication and saying, hey, we're all here, you should start writing more content. That stuff really works.
That's interesting. So did that Australian community media, was that effective because it sort of gathered it all together in one place, and then when they went looking for it, those local publications, it's there and it's easier for them to find? So that actually works better than reaching out to your local publication in general, because they don't want the inbound. they want to go and find the content, right?
The reality of every journalist everywhere, whether it's a design journalist or newspaper journalist, whatever it is, they're trying to do so much more with so much less. So less budget, photography budget's out the window for most publications, and the editorial teams are getting cut constantly. So I think once you realize that what you have as an architect, if you're producing beautiful content, so well photographed content that's interesting, you have this real opportunity to go and connect with people who are looking for that content because they don't have enough time to go and produce it anymore. They don't have the budgets to go and produce it. And that's definitely been a shift, within publishing in general, but definitely within architectural media. Publications used to create a lot of the content themselves, and now that burden, or perhaps we like to look at it as an opportunity for architects, is now falling to the architects to do that.
Yeah, so I definitely want to ask you some questions about sort of putting ourselves in the editor's shoes or the journalist's shoes. How can we kind of make their life a little bit easier? But I'm interested to kind of get your take on. In fact, no, let's actually go there, because I think that's such a really good point you raised, that they are trying to do a lot more with less, and this sort of part of the process that Bowerbird has been a really strong advocate for, and you, Nick, and the rest of the Bowerbirders have been, speaking about over the last few years, has been to try and encourage architects to be proactive about being kind of maybe a bit strategic in how we think about framing our projects and producing media kits, simplifying the information down, making it easier to understand for journalists. How does an editor or a journalist go about covering architecture in 2020, in the mainstream media? Let's look outside of the architecture media and just, why does it come on their radar? Is it that architecture is kind of what do they see as newsworthy in architecture these days? I'd just love to get your kind of thoughts on, how they're sort of perceiving it.
If you do look at the mainstream media, or we'll say more mainstream media, because some of the design media now is moving into that mainstream realm where things like Design Boom, where their audience is much broader than just design nerds. I think that regardless of where you're talking about, you're trying to deliver something for your audience. So as a journalist, you're going, what do my audience want to read? If you're talking about online, there's this clickbait stuff, and I know there's lots of commentary out there about the Instagrammable architecture and interior design thing, which a lot of people lament. But really, you're looking for something that relates to your readers. So that clickbait or that click content, whatever that archy porn, people are going, oh look, I want to see myself in that space, or that's amazing. I want to check that out. So I think journalists and particularly people still working at print publications, they're looking for a balanced selection of projects in each issue, and even online as well. They don't want to keep pushing out the same sort of content, so they are always looking for different. We have this sort of graph that we use, which is unique and sexy. So if something is really unique, it's got a lot of it will have a lot of journalist interest. And if it's really sexy, like if it's just, even if it's been seen, like similar things have been seen before, if it's really beautiful, it's going to get interest as well. And wherever you are along that continuum, you can actually have these projects that are unique and beautiful, absolutely stunning. And those are always the ones that will get picked up. And so a lot of people, a lot of those ones, when you're scrolling through Dezeen, you'll just see lots and lots of those sorts of projects. But really, I think that's the key. Journalists are looking for things that their audience will like, because the money machine behind publishing is looking to sell ads or copies of magazines, whatever it happens to be. So it needs to be attractive to the audience. And I think this is one of the things that I try to get through to architects is, if you are trying to get to that mainstream audience, but even the architectural audience as well, try to put your potential clients in that place. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to get your clients to talk about what it is that you're doing. And it's a tricky thing. Sometimes clients don't want to be involved. I always think it's amazing that architects are able to get photographs of houses anyway, because a lot of clients will be like, oh, I don't know how to, if I want that. But if you can get your clients to talk, whether that's just, through testimonials or whether they can actually be featured in an article, that is the kind of stuff that journalists love. And a lot of the news media and just print publications as well, they want to be able to talk about the clients, and they also like to be able to talk about the budget, which is an unusual thing. But sometimes those are the things that will get you over the line. So maybe it's an article in Dwell magazine. They want to talk to the clients. They'll probably want to have a photo of the clients, and they'll want to talk about budget. And the number of times I've seen projects not get into a publication like Dwell because of those reasons.
Dwell specifically, even not wanting to use the client's real first names can be you're out. It's tough. Well, I think that's an interesting thing to talk about, because I think a lot of architects, there's this thing around your moral rights, your ability to go and photograph the house. That's one thing, and that's usually accepted around the world, that architects should be able to do that. But really, you've got to be thinking about media from the beginning all the way through, rather than just waiting until the project's done, then going, okay, we're bringing the photographer in, and the client's like, oh, they're kind of stepping back. And if you've waited for gardens to grow in and things like that, that house kind of belongs to them now. And so if you haven't got that good relationship, or that consistent relationship around the fact that there is going to be a media, some sort of media at the end of this, then it can be a really difficult conversation to have. And I think a lot of new practices, they often get caught up in that, and their first projects, they'll actually get blocked by the client. And it's one of those things where it might be in the contract, but
basically irrelevant at that point. So we often talk about having that conversation really early on, and then as you're starting to get to that point where the project's coming to completion, before they've felt themselves move in, before they've taken true ownership of the project, bring it up again and start talking about oh, this space is going to photograph beautifully. We've got our photographer John, he's going to come in and photograph this space, and just bring it back up at that point and make sure that that's apparent that that's going to happen. But we also talk about that photo shoot being the true handover of the project. And if you can get that into people's minds, we're going to do a shoot, it's going to be a really fun day, we'll bring the champagne, whatever it is. Starting to think about those things. If you're a resident, obviously we're talking about residential architecture. But I think that idea of thinking about your project right from the beginning, it's not in a cynical way. It's not in a I'm a big marketer sort of way. You don't have to be, constantly doing tacky posts on Instagram or whatever. People like to see the journey, not deterring people from doing Instagram posts. But really, you're trying to prepare this content, and the best way to do that is to be thinking about it the whole way along. What is the story of this project? Why is it different? And the great thing about architecture is every project is different. People will come to us at Bowerbird and say, what sort of success rates do you get for publishing? And we go, well, first of all, we say, look, we wouldn't be meeting with you if we didn't think you were going to have a whole heap of success here. But it's this thing of everything is different. Every project is different. Every practice is different. Every audience is different. So you can't actually just measure and say, oh, do this, get this result. So I think, lean into that, really figure out what is different about the project. And invariably, if you have a different client, different architect, each project is going to be completely different.
Yeah. And if you're going to be a really cynical marketer, you would actually sort of allow that maybe to even influence you throughout the design process, but that's kind of forbidden to
plenty of people out there doing it though.
Exactly. Thinking this project needs to be more interesting maybe is a sort of thought that you could naturally sort of see running through your mind, even though it's not something that we really talk that openly about as
I think most editors would see through though, or they do see through those sorts of things. So especially, again, I'll say print editors. So I suppose it's something to talk about. Print, we look at print now, and there's not a heap more magazines than there used to be. But I don't think it's had the decline that perhaps other sectors have had within print. But really, the difference between print and online generally is that print is able to spend a bit more money producing good journalistic content than not republishing press releases. Again, this is generalization, but our view is that that's what's happening. So that the quality of a print article or a print journalist is going to be much more critical of a project, and they're going to dig a little deeper and make sure that the story is unique or just very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, interesting. So the unique, sexy, grid
paradigm. Yeah.
It's really interesting to think about how to position a project on that. Do you think that the intended sort of target audience plays or the intended publication that you're aiming for plays a big part in what is the unique factor that you focus on about the project, or what makes it sexy? Is that kind of eye in the beholder based on where you're hoping that it'll kind of end up?
I think this is probably one of the traps that people fall into. So the idea that you need to package your project up in a particular way for a particular publication. There's no doubt that certain print publications like a certain photographic style. And that's where you want to be talking to your photographer and saying, look, ultimately we'd like this to end up somewhere like Dwell. Or somewhere like Wallpaper. And if you've hired yourself a good architectural photographer, they're going to understand the nuances there. But beyond that, beyond sort of targeting one print publication, which is a bit of a Hail Mary unless you've already locked it in beforehand, really, it's just got to be beautiful architectural images, well shot, and it's going to find so many places out there. And this idea that you sort of go, okay, well, we're going to pitch this story in this particular way to this publication, then we're going to change it and pitch it this way to another publication. I would just say give as much information to all the journalists as you possibly can. They will pick and choose the pieces that they like. If you give someone 200 words, they've only got 200 words to work with.
Yeah.
So, people talk about copy paste. So you'll put together a statement, and all of these blogs will just sort of paste the same content. Well, if you give 1,000 words worth of content within a press kit, none of them are going to print or publish 1,000 words on a website. They're going to choose bits and pieces. Yeah. So, I think just give as much as you can. And I think this is something that I go back to all the time, because when I was working in-house for a design publisher, I was the web editor. And we had to push out, I think it was 10 stories a week on each one of our websites. So it was a lot of content. And we were, trying to be properly journalistic about it back then as well. So writing the content, not just copying and pasting. But there was Andrew Maynard Architects, now Austin Maynard Architects, has always been a legend in my mind for sharing content with the media. Yeah. So when they finish a project, they put all of their content on a page on their website, all of the images, high-res images to download, and like more text than you can usually do anything with. And that to me is the model. You should be providing way more content than any one publication can use. And they definitely do that thing of, we talk about exclusives, where certain print publications, or most print publications, will want a period of exclusivity on a project. That means they want to publish it first and they want to protect that content for a period of time, or they might just want it protected until it gets published. So I'm sure Austin Maynard do that as well. But the idea was, when I was a digital editor, I'd be sitting there going, okay, I've only got 7 stories this week. Where am I going to go to get that content? And this was before Bowerbird. And so Maynard was always the place that I would go first. Wow, I'd know that even older projects, I could revamp them. I could come up with a new angle on an older project, but I know that all that content's there. And all I really need to do, if permission's already been given, which it kind of was a blanket permission given at that point with Andrew, I'd be able to go on, download content, publish a story.
That's so cool.
And I think when Nick came to me with the idea all those years ago, that was when I went, that's it. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to give journalists access to that content,
information about the projects as much as possible.
Yeah.
Because prior to Bowerbird, and the idea of a media kit in the small architecture space is just unheard of, really. I mean, what were people doing? Putting a little bit of a description on their website, and that was about it.
I tell you what, if you're lucky,
right? Yeah, if you're lucky, it's usually just a few pictures.
It's surprising to us now. Like, I think in Melbourne, we've been here for such a long time, and our community is so savvy when it comes to media.
Yeah.
And just storytelling, sharing their projects.
Yeah.
But we still have, so many practices that we meet with. And we say, oh, what do you currently do with media? And they say, oh, well, we've been approached here and there by editors. So this idea that you just sit back and wait for editors to knock on your door. And, that would work great if all of the editors worked on your street and they walk past your office and they're seeing, a project in your window.
At your site. Yeah.
But that's not the reality of media anymore. No. Editors don't have time to go for a walk down the street, to be perfectly honest. So I think that that idea that editors will come to you and your work speaks for itself. Your work may, with images, speak for itself. But if you can't be found, how are those editors going to find you? And I think quite often architects will look at these, what we call hero publications. So there's usually a local or, countrywide publication that everyone respects, a journal or a very well-respected sort of Homes magazine that people know about. And they spend all their energy trying to get into that. And maybe they'll get in once a year. But you're missing all of these opportunities that are out there now. There are so many websites. There are so many Instagram accounts. There are YouTube channels. There are all these things. And if you're not proactively putting yourself out there, someone else will get that publication.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Just going quickly back to Austin Maynard's website, or previously when it was Andrew Maynard, when you were in your role, was this just looking at it really practically, was this a page that would be sort of hidden, or are we talking about the project pages and they were just overwhelmingly full of information, very candid?
It was definitely my understanding is that it was definitely a media strategy.
Yep.
So it wasn't just that their website had a lot of
Yep.
content on it for each project. I mean, it may have been the website as well. I
Yep.
feel like that might have shifted now. I'd have to go
Sure.
back and
Yep.
have a
Yep.
look.
Yep.
But I think, having special content for press is going to be really important.
Yep.
Clients don't necessarily need all of that detail, and they might
Right.
find it
Okay.
overwhelming. So images, yes, that's fine.
Yep.
Include all your images on your website. I don't see any problem with that. But as far as providing a lot of detailed content, it's probably better to
information, like the who's involved, all that kind of all the detail that you would probably want to convey to the media is probably not going to be
not as relevant.
The first impression that you're necessarily going to give to.
But in saying that package of content could be something that you wheel out when you're having a client meeting.
Absolutely.
Maybe one of the first meetings where you can actually go, well, look, this is all the content that we prepare for the media, and you can see the products and all of those things. So I think you will never be sad about creating that content. That will never be wasted time. But I think as your website and most architects that we talk to are getting a better understanding that their website is the portal for their clients more than anything. And then as far as the media, you can have a separate portal. So something like Bowerbird or that detailed press kit is important.
That's very, very cool. So you mentioned the sort of the two factors that you think that the mainstream media kind of is especially in love with, which is kind of the client and the money and sort of maybe, ironically, but kind of really the two things that architects are really eager to omit from any communication about their projects generally. Those are the two things that we want to be secretive about, the money and the clients, and it's kind of flipped in terms of what's actually interesting to people. So
it could be because of that.
Because
these
it's
are things that,
right.
that aren't spoken about.
It's taboo, right? We never get to find out about kind of the lives of these clients.
I think it's. I think it's really this. It feeds into this narrative around architecture being an elitist thing. So we don't talk about money. We sort of hide the clients away quite often, and I don't think that that's architects doing that. I think it's architects being sensitive to their clients, being respectful, not sensitive, but respectful of your clients. And so that becomes this really interesting thing. But what ends up happening is when you don't talk about something. So if you spend your whole time not talking about how much you charge for a service, people are going to just assume that that's really expensive.
Yeah.
So with architects not being able to have that conversation in some instances, or choosing not to, you sort of miss this opportunity, because there'll be a whole heap of people out there for whom that price is actually reasonable, and to miss that opportunity to talk about it. But you're also setting expectations. So I think the price is a really interesting one. So the cost of the project, it's something that people want to know. They want to know about it. Like you want to understand what something is going to cost. But you know what? The story is the thing that justifies that cost, and I think that's perhaps where some of the sensitivity comes from. It's this idea of people don't understand how much work goes into a project, so they're not going to be willing to pay that. So if you say to someone, this house extension was $1 million, and you're not telling a story, you're just going, here's the price. How are they supposed to understand the value in that? And I think the other interesting thing with the price for architects is that architects are going in and doing the fighting for a whole heap of other people who actually make that money, or that cost is sort of separated out across all these different people. But the architect is so often the one coming in and fighting for the budget for the build, fighting for the engineering budget, all of those things. And so as an architect, you're only getting a percentage of that, but you're fighting for the entire the entire amount. So I think that sensitivity around the cost or around the budget is it's understandable. I definitely don't blame anyone for not talking about it, but if you can talk about it, there are opportunities that come out of that as well.
Yeah. And do you think that as architects let's say in the residential space, maybe do start to work with wider audiences, or sort of non-traditional audiences for architectural services, let's put it that way, that maybe that sort of that culture of secrecy might start to kind of naturally shift or do you think that's kind of, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's this concept of category advertising, versus brand advertising. So most architects, I'm using the word advertising here, interchangeable
Yep.
with getting published
Yep.
or
Sure.
doing some marketing.
Yep.
Brand advertising, that's the equivalent of a practice going out and saying, John Smith Architects,
Yep.
this is what we do. And you're trying to get people to come to you, just to your company.
Yep.
The problem that architecture has is that maybe architecture is only getting 10% of the potential market. So the whole industry is only getting 10% of the potential market somewhere. So what architecture needs to do is category advertising. And so there are organizations that do this to an extent, but they're often very professionally focused. So things like registration boards, things like that, they're going out there and saying, this is why an architect is important. But the burden shouldn't just be upon them. So if you're an architect and you're promoting your work, you aren't just promoting your work, you're promoting the practice of architecture. So if we as a community all go out there, not saying architects here, but the entire community goes out there and tries to get that other 90% of people to understand what it is that architects do, we grow the pie. There are so many more opportunities. You're not fighting for clients anymore. There's more clients than you could possibly service. So, I think that idea of getting out to the mainstream and doing that category advertising, architecture exists, and this is why it's important. Everyone has a role to play in that, and great if it has a benefit to your brand, which it will. But if it has a benefit to your brand, that's great. But remember that every piece of work that you do to communicate your work has a benefit to the whole sector and the whole industry.
That's interesting. It's very interesting, because that's also sort of it's an interesting dilemma in terms of what are the incentives for small architecture practices to make the effort in terms of two things, like advertising to, again, advertising, but communicating, should we say, to a much bigger addressable market than they're ever possibly, looking to actually work for, whether that's geographically or just the broadness of the entire community. And they might see themselves as a lot more niche and targeted than that. So in a sense, they could see that getting published or investing the effort in getting published in the more mainstream media, it's kind of maybe potentially in their mindset casting the net a little bit too wide, perhaps. And there's also the geographic component, which is that, typically a lot of architects get their work from within this really skinny little radius around their office, and then, they're not really interested in the further afield stuff, or at least it doesn't seem like that happens. So it's tough, because how do you grow the pie? How do you do these things that are a little bit broader in nature when,
I'll use a euphemism for fake news here. It's a false narrative.
Yeah.
So any business outside of architecture, any business where you said, look, cast your net wider.
Yeah.
Everyone would go, of course, yeah. However I can build my audience, however I can get out to more people is a great thing. And for some reason within architecture, and I think we can sort of understand why it is. The idea is that you want to be more exclusive. Usually that's because a higher cost product, like we are generally talking about a higher cost product, by creating that narrative of exclusiveness and, finding the right clients and, that being harder has a lot of benefit. It means that you can justify, and I don't think that there's massive profits. I'm not suggesting that it's a massive profit business, but it is a high cost product, I suppose, that architects are putting out there. So, I think this idea of, if I cast my net too wide, I'm going to end up with, whether that's tire kickers or I'm going to have clients that I don't like. It's false. What you need to be doing is making sure that your message is very clear. So what is the work that you want to do more of? That's what we always say to anyone that we meet. What work would you like to be doing more of? And usually architects can say that straight away with absolute certainty. This is the work we like doing, and we'd like to get more of those clients. Once you know that, the way you talk about your projects is going to, and usually that's talking about your clients and the story behind the projects, that's going to relate to those people. So if you love working with, families of 4 with dogs, share the projects that are a family of 4 with dogs, if you have that content, but start to share those things. And quite often I think architects, especially in small residential practices, they're wanting to find people like them because that's a much easier conversation. They know how to design for people like them. So the easiest way, even if you don't have any projects, is to talk about you. So if you're a 30-something couple with 1 kid and a dog, put that on the website, talk about that. So once you get that figured out, once you figure out what it is that you want and you start talking about that, casting your net wide, you're not going to end up with any of these people who don't relate to that. You're going to end up with more of the people who do relate to it. So anyone who says, oh, we don't want to get published here or there, I struggle with. And that's not, I'm a journalist. I'm not from a marketing, advertising background. I'm saying that from a professional sense, that you want to be doing that. Spread it as far and wide as you can. And I think there are some architects who worry about particular publications because of the ethics of those publications, and this is usually around particular newspaper, supplements and things like that, where it could be a particular, internationally high-profile person for whom they go like, let's go with that. And so they don't want to be featured in that. And I think that is a really missed opportunity to be doing this category advertising to a new area, a new part of the market. So people might go, oh, but the people who are reading that publication, they're not really going to be my kind of people. They're going to be someone who I don't want to work with. And it goes on both sides. I'm not suggesting that there's a left-right thing there. It's just you'll have different people who are attracted to different audiences or different publications. What I would say is when you're talking to that audience about the work that you're doing, it is a broad audience. So it's there's going to be a lot of people. It's not just people who buy it. It's the people who sit down in a cafe and happen to read it because it's the only thing there. Yeah. So if you can be talking to them about what you do, and the value of what you do, you're going to find those clients. So anyone who says, we just prefer to go to the local schoolyard and talk to the parents there, that's how we get all of our work. Well, those are the people who are reading publications as well. So it's reinforcing with those people. Just spread it far and wide. Make sure that the stories that you're telling relate to the people you want to work with.
Yeah, and that's been your mantra for as long as I remember. Bowerbird's mantra is like spread it far and wide. And I think it's interesting because, there is a tendency to want to, there's something very attractive about the idea that targeted is better, and it just may not be. It's not really based on anything. It's just, you could really, I've definitely gone down that road of, in certain circumstances, having a bias towards a more targeted strategy because I think it sounds better on paper, right? but in reality, as long as you're focused on the message being, I don't know what the right word is, not accurate, but maybe compelling, maybe honest, maybe a good reflection of what your work is about, then broad is good.
Yeah, and I think that I think the concern is legitimate, and I think we see this across all media now, and it plays back into what I was saying before, that journalists are time poor, and so you end up with this press release regurgitation, right? Yeah. That's real, not sort of don't want to plaster over that, but what you're able to do with that is the important thing. So if you're spreading your message far and wide, if your images around your architecture is getting out there more, yes, there's an archi-porn element which is massive and growing, but you're also competing with other content. So you're out there to say, you know what, even though this is archi-porn, here's architecture, and the content that goes with it is going to talk about architects and the value of architects. No matter how you look at it, that is going to be in there, and you're going out to a much broader audience with that content. So I think there's definitely concerns around that, and as a company, we're aware of those things, and that's why we like to support all different publications and all different forms of journalism, because we don't want to lose that sort of critical thought or that high quality journalism as well. So. I think there's it's not to say that you're insane for going, oh, but I don't really want to be featured on this Instagram account. You have a right to choose where you want your content to go, but it's definitely something that we should be thinking about, getting out to a much broader audience, even if the benefits from that aren't seen until the next generation of architects start up. I think most architects understand it's their obligation to sort of promote the profession as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And probably it's not something that you can kind of do once as a profession. Let's say once a decade, have a good go at it, educate the public, Grand Designs comes out, the archi-porn's taking off, and then just coast for the next 30 years and not change anything, right? Like it needs to be.
It'd be nice though, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be nice, wouldn't it? But the public, there needs to be that constant sort of re-education, right? And putting it out there and keep on messaging around it and keeping it up to date, right?
Yeah, and I think we've touched on it a few times, but it's not just about spreading out far and wide online, for example.
Yep.
You want to be hitting all these different
Yep.
types of media and events, and you just want to be making it part of your regular, it's a habit. Once a week
Yep.
you're going to go and try and get something published. And I think, coming back to Open House, so I used to work for Open House Melbourne. That's why I sort of can talk about it
Yep.
with some authority. So, those programs are probably the best public outreach programs that you can do. So if you have
Yep.
an open house program in your city, no joke, send them an email today,
Yep.
and say, I'd like to take part. And again, that can be difficult with private homes, but talk to your clients about those sorts of things, because most architecture clients understand that they're custodians of something as well. They understand that home is going to last a long time. And that they might not always be the people who live there or inhabit that space.
Sure.
So, that's the most important thing that we can do. Get out to more of the public. And I think, with the open house program, that's a really interesting one, because there's like this it's like this gateway drug. A lot of the public come to those open house things to go and see the historic buildings, or large public buildings.
Yep.
And then they get drawn in, and they're like, oh, there's a house around the corner for me. I'm gonna go and check that out as well.
Exactly.
And all of a sudden, you end up with thousands and thousands of Archie nerds roaming around.
Absolutely. Yeah, even like seeing from my own experience with my clients, even if they haven't been part of an open house program because maybe the timing's not right or whatever, but they run their own open house and promote that as much as they can, and that's really some of the most successful, some of the most real and authentic sort of introductions to the general public that you can get, really. Like, even it doesn't all have to be kind of online stuff. It can be that offline element as well. I like that you mentioned that point about doing something every week, which I feel like, knowing architects, is really at odds with how they tend to go about their media and their PR, or their marketing, where it's kind of like a very big surge of activity coinciding with, getting the photos back from your photographer that lasts for a week or two, and then practically nothing until the next time you've got a new project. So in terms of sort of things that people can do more consistently in between projects, do you have any sort of suggestions beyond just sort of sending the project out in that first go?
It's always, you're always going to have a spike when a project comes in. You're going to have extra work to do, but I would just be setting aside time each week. So the interesting thing about architecture is you tend to not have these weekly processes, because projects stretch out over a really long period. So, having that weekly structure is sort of different for a project. But as far as your marketing and your media and what you're doing, it's very easy to have one task that you do. And we often talk about, Friday afternoon, sitting down with a beer or a wine or a coffee, and just kind of going, all right, I'm going to do some work on that. I'm going to do some marketing. I'm going to reach out to 5 journalists. If you're doing that once a week, and it could be less than an hour's worth of work, you're going to have that consistency. It's going to run throughout the year. And the thing about architecture is you keep building up this content. So you're building up new, unique content every time you finish a project, every time you get to a new stage on a project. So over time, you have these projects, they might be 10 years old, that still have relevance. There's publications that are cropping up now that weren't around 10 years ago. But if the photography stands up and the design stands up, if they haven't aged, you've got a whole new audience there. More people, more pairs of eyes that can see that. So if you can just have that weekly task where you're going in, and it might be, I know you would have dealt with this a lot, but it might be posting a few or scheduling a few posts on Instagram. It might just be updating your website, whatever it is, even if it's just half an hour each week, that is going to put you leaps and bounds ahead of anyone who's not focusing on that.
Yeah. Or even just trying to capture what happened, what decisions were made in the project in the previous week, as part of knowing that you're going to be publishing that project at a certain point in time, and starting to even look forward maybe, and not having to do it all as one big kind of rush when you finish the project. That's really, really cool. So, I mean, that's something that it's just, it feels like it's not caught on as general practice. And I like that point you made about just the difference between the two timelines, and that there's this much quicker cycle that marketing and sort of communication and business development happens on, and then architecture is this kind of long, slow, grinding process that unfolds over, you know, months or maybe even years sometimes. Do you guys find that, you know, in terms of the conversations that you have with your customers, the architecture practices that are in your community, do you kind of have conversations with them in those periods kind of leading up to once things are starting to get closer with a finished project? Is that when, you know, people start reaching out to you guys? What sort of conversations do you have with firms, or what kind of advice do they come to you guys for around the time a project is getting nearer to being completed?
Usually that's when people sign up to Bowerbird. Is when they finish the project. So I've lost count of the number of people who sort of say, oh, we'll sign up when we get to our next project, you know, which is in 6 months time or 3 months time. So it's definitely an impetus when something finishes and you've got those photographs. It's an impetus, but we talk to people about consistency. You know, you need to be consistent and remember that the content that you think is old, you know, the project that you put to bed and probably had all these headaches that went with it. You know, you might have put it to bed 6 months ago. You could just be getting the photographs now and actually be really, you know, triggered by by those photos. Lean into it and really look at the content that you've got and keep trying to push that out. You are always going to connect with someone, whether it's an Instagram account or website or print. There's print publications that publish work that isn't, you know, immediate, that isn't exclusive. They're looking for themed, you know, or issues around themes. So just make it a habit, continually do it, and it pays off. And in big ways, in ways that you don't notice. These little bites of things that you do over a year. If you're spending, I don't know, 52 hours a year on your media, by the end of that year, you're going to see huge, huge dividends, which is that your profile online, even things as simple as SEO, search engine optimization. If you're getting your projects out on websites that are dedicated to architecture and design, and those are pointing back to you, when someone's searching for, you know, architecture practices in Melbourne, whatever it happens to be, you're going to bump up higher than other practices. So, you know, I think every little bit that you can do will benefit to the whole, and in no time at all, in architectural terms, you'll have a much better profile out there.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. And we're kind of talking from the perspective of people that actually see the different trajectories that firms go on over time. And we see the ones that are pretty active and consistent, how well they do, and unbelievably well in certain cases, just from some of those small activities that they've done that really, you know, haven't replaced or been a big sacrifice in terms of, you know, eating up time that they were spending with clients. It's usually just a small amount of stuff, but just, you know, every week, every couple of weeks, but just consistently, and a variety of things as well. I think not just getting too singular focused on one thing, right? So it's not just Instagram images, but you mentioned some other things as well: SEO, filling out that project information, contacting some journalists.
So many things you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just ask you quickly about kind of establishing relationships with specific journalists, because this is something that seems to be fairly commonplace at the firms that you tend to notice getting published all the time. And there's sort of a well, you know, where we have a good relationship with a certain publication, or
it's who you know.
Yeah, there's a sort of a network aspect to it as well. And I mean, that seems a little bit kind of, you know, maybe not in the spirit of what you guys kind of push for, which is that there's this broad sort of spider web of different kind of media across different mediums and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, even when you're dealing with, as an architect, when you're actually dealing with a specific journalist, whether or not you are going to go on to have a long-lasting relationship with them, there's still a sort of, maybe there's some etiquette to how to actually work with a journalist and have a relationship with them, and how to be courteous to them. Is there any sort of mistakes that you see architects making that, from your experience in the media, you think, oh no, I can't believe that you've done that? Like, does stuff like that ever kind of?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is those things. I think I feel like there's sort of two parts there.
Yeah,
so
there's two parts. There's the sort of the network aspect. I'm interested in your thoughts on that, and then
Yeah. So really, I think a lot of people will look at those people that they respect, so those practices that they respect,
Yep.
and they'll go, "Oh, how they built a relationship with that editor there.
Yep.
I need to get a relationship with that
Yep.
editor." And the reality of it is that a lot of these editors are ex-architects or
That's
from,
true.
from a design
They
background
went to uni
themselves, and they may have
together. Yeah. Yeah.
may have
Yeah.
gone to uni together.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not diminishing those. Those are fantastic relationships,
Yep.
and they result in some really good content. But I think to look and try and be that person
Mm.
now is a mistake. So
Mm.
if you're a younger practice or a smaller practice, or even just you haven't raised your profile
Mm-hmm.
enough, look for those editors that are coming up through the ranks,
Mm-hmm.
and start off by making friends with them. And we're not just talking about editors at a publication; we're talking about freelance writers as well.
Yeah.
Freelance writers are the best people you could ever know, right? Find freelance writers, and do you know how you do that? You flick through the magazine that you that you've got on, that
The
everyone
names,
seems
they're
to
written there, right?
subject.
You just,
There'll be a list of their names, or it'll be on every article. Go and connect with them on LinkedIn.
yeah,
Like, don't be afraid of
tell them
things
you
like
love their
LinkedIn.
article. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you know what? The thing about freelancers is they make money from every article that they get published. So
Yep.
you help them to make money. Compared to editors who are very busy generally, or in-house journalists, they're very busy producing a lot of other content. They're still interested in your success as well.
Yeah.
But freelancers are very interested. They want to find that content before anyone else, so they can pitch it to different publications. So that's one thing to think about. Don't look at it as, hey, there's 5 editors. If I don't know one of them, I'm not going to get published. There are hundreds and thousands of editors
That's
and freelance
interesting.
writers out there that you should be looking to. So networks aren't built with 5 people. They're built with hundreds.
That's so interesting your point about, because I want to get the kind of insider info on sort of the actual the kind of the org chart of a publication and
Yeah.
the role of the freelance writer, because I think a lot of times when architects are thinking of building kind of a lead list of these are people that I want to kind of reach out to, they do come across the freelance writer and they kind of maybe dismiss that or write that off and go like, they're not part of the furniture at this place. They're just kind of whatever. They're somebody, not worth time. Move on. Let's find somebody who's kind of there every day kind of thing. But that's an interesting kind of depiction of a freelancer who is actually very, very incentivized to get involved in a project, pitch a project. So is that pretty commonplace in?
Very, very
Really?
commonplace across print, and online.
Yep.
Lots of online contributors. Look at something like Dwell.com.
Yep.
So Dwell.com pays for content from freelance writers for online. So there's a lot of freelance writers who are trying to pump out content for Dwell.com, sorry. And so really go to somewhere like Dwell.com. Look for those writers. They could be based in your backyard, or they could be based in, who knows, San Francisco, wherever.
Yep.
Find out who they are. You can follow them on Dwell. Dwell is a bit of a sort of social platform as well. You can follow them, jump onto LinkedIn, follow them there, jump onto Instagram, follow them there. They're really invested in you because you essentially that you're the product that they're selling. So yeah, I mean, freelancers are way more important or way more valuable than just knowing one editor at one publication.
That's so interesting. So the freelancer, so sort of break that down for me, how that works. So a freelancer will see a project that they think is really interesting, go, oh, brilliant, I'm going to write a story on that. Will they then go to their kind of Rolodex of maybe editors or publications that they think that the project would be a good fit for? And do they say, this project's really cool, would you like me to write a story on it? Or do they go ahead and write the story and then sort of go, here's the... It's more they pitch it. Yeah.
There's so many different ways that different writers do things. Like I know of writers who will partner with a photographer to go and actually get all of that content together and then pitch it to a publication. Essentially, prospective work that they're doing there. That's not very common. The most common example is what you've said there. So they will a freelance writer or a contributor will look at a project and go, I think that's going to work really well over here. They'll also be considering things like, I know that publication is full up and they're not going to publish anything for the next 12 months. I'm going to go over here instead. So they're really working quite actively with those editors. And the interesting thing, the shift that's happened over the last few years is that there was a whole heap of editorial teams that got slashed just as print became less lucrative.
Yep.
And so a lot of those editors, in-house editors, are now out there working as freelance writers.
Yeah.
So it sort of shifted things a bit and I guess casualized the workforce within editorial. So those, you're talking about people who not only are very good writers, but they understand the machinations of publishing. So they're going to know exactly who wants what when. And again, they're going to keep pushing until they get you a piece of media. Someone wants to publish something. And basically, if that freelancer can't find, they don't have the connections with the particular publications, there'll be another one who will go through and, essentially go and pitch it to a whole other tranche of editors.
Sort of on a similar note, but I've come across quite a few practices who have really invested like really an arm and a leg in copywriting services, either to do with their media kit or their I guess that they try to attach it into their award submission. Maybe we're trying to kind of killing two birds with one stone, but
that's really smart.
Yeah, well, it is. But do you what are your sort of thoughts on that level of, at what point does an architect who's struggling to really frame their story, or to sort of see that with that sort of objectivity around what's interesting about their project, there seems to be an idea of, well, I make the big investment with the copywriter who will help to sort of enlighten me as to what's kind of the best way to communicate this project. How do you sort of see the role of, is it a good idea for architects to bring in those kind of external consultants and maybe invest those resources if they can, or what are your sort of...
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna be different for different people, right? Yeah, it's your budget, it's what you're. So one thing we do say is if you agonize over creating content, if you spend a week trying to put together content, whether that's for an award submission or for a publication, that your time is more valuable than that. Just look at it in very simple terms. What would you be billing, per hour if that was a project you were working on, and does that stack up for you? Do you want to spend, especially a lot of sort of directors or architects who are in charge, they'll spend all this time. It's like, actually, your money, you could go off and make $10,000 in a week, and is that worth it when you could pay someone $1,000 to produce that content? So that's probably the first thing that I would always do is just go, how long does it take you to create the content, and are you happy with the content that comes out? And we always say every architect is capable, anyone who is working within architecture is capable of putting together a really clear story. And we use brief challenges solutions, beginning, middle, and end. If you just write those 3 titles down and provide some content, you're going to get the story across to journalists. Is there value in hiring a copywriter? And actually, this is something, it's a common thing that comes up, which when you're on the publishing side, you kind of forget that it's not really clear. So copywriter essentially is someone who you are paying to produce content for you to use in awards, in press releases on your website, right? That's what a copywriter does. And that's different to a freelance writer or a journalist. They are getting paid by the publication to produce independent content. So they're not beholden to you. If a freelance writer is writing a story about your project, they're being journalistic, right? So they don't actually have any requirement to send you a draft of the article. Quite often they will nowadays, but a true journalist will say, no, I'm happy to send you quotes. Like if I quote you directly, I'll send that to you. So don't assume that because a freelance writer is writing an article on your project that you have a right to see that before it's published. Quite often you won't. But within architecture, generally writers are more interested in making sure that the facts are accurate. So they'll send it to you. But that's a really good one, actually, just for I'm sure all the freelance writers out there will love me for saying this. If someone's sending you a draft of an article, that's not an invitation for you to go and edit that. It's a fact-checking exercise. So it's to avoid there being any mistakes. It's not an opportunity for you to rewrite something. So just if you're tempted, don't do it. Please don't do it. But yeah, copywriters, you're hiring them to write content directly for you. Some of that content might end up on websites and things like that, but really you're engaging them, so you're paying them to produce that content. It's there are so many reasons to do that, and not least of which would be there's a whole heap of fantastic writers out there who will be able to interview you, understand who the clients are that you are wanting to get, and write content that is attractive to them. So absolutely, it will be worth it. If you get a good copywriter, it will be worth it. It'll be worth it with the time you saved. It'll be worth it with the quality of the content on the other side. But you don't have to do that in order to get published. You don't have to do it in order to get good content up on your website. Don't feel like that's a cost, necessarily a cost of doing business. I think you will step up. You'll take steps up in your media. So for the first year, you might be producing your own content because it's all you can afford. The next year, you might get a cash injection. You go, you know what? I want to help. I want someone to come in and write my awards content for me. And while they're doing that, they're going to write some web copy for you. You're going to take steps up, no matter whether you've been around for 10 years or 2 weeks. You're going to take these steps up as you start to invest in your communication. So yeah. Totally worth it. I'm a writer.
Awesome.
I'll always say it's totally worth it. You need to know who you're working with. So if you've got someone who's offering copywriting services, ask them for examples of the content that they've created, other clients that they've worked with, the basic stuff of due diligence when you go to engage someone. But at Bowerbird, we provide information on the best people or the appropriate people. We work with a lot of copywriters and a lot of freelance writers. So you can actually come to us and say, hey, we're wanting someone to produce content. And what we can do is that next level up, which is match you with someone that matches, rather than you going out and researching people who might actually just quite frankly be too expensive for you. We can actually match that and go, well, you'd probably be looking at someone like this compared to someone like this.
That's really interesting.
That's not a paid service. I'm not.
So that's just you open up the live chat support in the bottom right and ask away, and you can get Bowerbird to. I'm going to ruin your support. I'm going to ruin your intercom inbox. You can just basically ask for any kind of favor in terms of advice or strategic services.
Well, the beauty of that is, and the way that the internet works now is that if you get 10 people asking the same question, you write a support post for it, or you do a little video for it, and then everyone else who comes and asks that question again gets to benefit from it. So we love that. We love it when we get asked the same question over and over again, because we make it easier for people to access that content.
And do you do the same sort of, do you find yourself giving the same sorts of recommendations around or matchmaking around photographers as well? Is that also something that's quite common?
We're often asked. Usually when we meet with architects, they'll ask us those questions, because usually what we're trying to figure out is, like, we don't want to go in and say, hey, you should be using a different photographer. If someone's happy with their photographer, we're going to leave that well alone. But quite often people will come to us and say, oh yeah, we're shopping around for a photographer, or we're wanting to get a different style for different projects. That quite often happens. So it might be a different sector. So a commercial project is very different to a residential one. They'll want a different shot. And because we know so many photographers, we can say, look, you're wanting to look at these people here. And the other thing is we get a sense of budgets, how much people have how much money people have, and who they should be meeting with. So in the same way that I was saying, find those editors who are sort of at the same point as you. That's what we always say around photography as well, especially if you're a younger practice starting out. You might look to these amazing photographers who are, world class. And, they charge for it, justifiably so. But we'll be able to know some people who are up and coming, who are going to get that level of quality that's, makes you really publishable, but fits a bit more with your budget. So there's so many services out there now. Like we basically don't need to give much advice other than, hey, go and talk to this person because they're awesome. And we don't have exclusive relationships there. There's people we're not going and getting affiliate stuff. That's not how we work. We want to make sure that we're agnostic to everyone, and that we're trying to make that match that we think works. And that's we've done that many times all around the world, where we've matched people up who are still working together today. So
do you sort of do you think that the architecture media space, whether that's photographers, writers, publications, social media, YouTube, like, do you think it's in growth at the moment, or neutral, or kind of more shrinking? I mean, how do you sort of see the health of the ecosystem overall?
Definitely growth. And I don't know that's, we don't really have an impression of whether that's growth in financial terms.
Of course, sure.
Potentially not, but definitely more publications are starting up than are closing down. And the interesting thing to note about architectural media at the moment, a lot of these print publications, not necessarily, I don't want to overstate it, but
Mm.
they're sort of like loss leaders. So I don't know if you know this about supermarkets, but
Mm-hmm.
you'll essentially supermarkets will sell their milk and their bread at a loss.
Yep.
They don't make money off it because
Yep.
it gets you into the supermarket to
Mm-hmm.
buy the more valuable things. Well, a lot of publishers now are starting to shift. So the print advertising isn't what it used to be.
Yep.
There is still, it still makes sense, but really they're trying to push people into other areas. So
Yep.
this is where you start to see things like Dezeen Awards, these awards programs where there's an entry fee, but also sponsors around that.
Yep.
They're moving into events, so they're holding physical events,
like,
conferences,
yeah,
absolutely.
all that kind of stuff.
So,
Mm-hmm.
so I think as an architect, once you understand the machine, the media machine, and
Mm-hmm.
you can look at traditional media to understand that. Something like we had Fairfax and Nine here in Australia, but Murdoch Media, all of that, they've got all these different arms, which is how they sort of have a consistency, and that they don't overexpose themselves in one area like print publishing, for example. So I think once you start to see that, it's actually, there's a lot of opportunities in that for architects. So you can enter something in an awards program that's run by a publisher, and then that gets on their website, and then that leads to other media being interested. So yeah, I mean, there's so much out there. The media landscape is massive.
Ben, give us a couple of more tricks of how we can, take advantage of the sort of diversification of the media business model. So entering awards is, potentially a really good way to sort of, I suppose, buy yourself a little bit of coverage or media attention. I mean, is there any other sort of tricks up your sleeve that you've kind of come across, or sort of you've identified and gone, oh, I think that's an opportunity, a loophole?
I mean, it's one of those things like the tips and tricks. Everyone wants to know the shortcut to something, and I think most architects appreciate that within architecture there's no shortcuts to anything.
That's the grown-up answer, Ben. I want the tricks. What can we do?
I don't think it's tricks. I think it's the things we've already spoken about.
Yep.
It's like the trick is you spend half an hour on your media a week.
Yep.
That's a trick.
Yep.
And it's beyond a trick. It's a skill that will serve you for the rest of your life. To just go, I'm going to spend some time telling my story across any number of different mediums. So, those are the things: consistency, doing good work. We talk about this upward spiral and a downward spiral. So when you're talking about the work you want to get more of, you just need to start to tell the story of that work. So you might not actually have the projects that perfectly package the clients that you want, but tell that story in a way. So let's say you've done a very small alteration to a house in a city house. It might not be unique and sexy. It could just be some really solid work, and you've got some really nice photography on it, but you want to tell the story, the parts of the story that will attract the clients that you want more of. So you can actually start to talk about what are the challenges of building an extension in a particular inner city context, and that's going to relate to lots of other people. So find that angle, and then what you do is you start to tell that story, and all of a sudden you attract more of those people with bigger budgets. And as you go on and you get the next project photographed, you have this upward spiral. So focus on those things. And look, there's another, Andrew Maynard's getting a lot of press out of this.
It happens on my blog too. I've got Andrew Maynard all over the place. We're just big
because
fans
he's done it very well. And one of the things we often talk about is, I mean, you've probably got international viewers here, but Andrew Maynard is sort of, top tier architects here in Melbourne, but respected all around the world. But, one of the first projects he got media on was a sort of academic study of this robot that went around eating cities. I actually can't even remember the full story, but if you search for Andrew Maynard robot dog, I think it'll come up. And those things. And he also engaged with the media in a professional sense. So he has a well-known essay that he wrote, I think for Arc Daily, I could have that wrong, around work-life balance within architecture.
Exactly.
So there are all these things that you can do, even as a young starting up practice. You might have no projects. Look at the things you can do. What are the skills you've got? What are the tools you've got? And what's the content that you've got? Start doing a bit of that. And again, 1 hour a week, especially if you're starting out as a practice, you're going to have that time. You're going to be able to carve that off and start to do some of that work. And I think, again, that's the upward spiral. You talk about the things you'd like to do more of, even if you haven't got them, and eventually you'll pick up that profile.
Yeah, and kind of like on that, I mean, the idea of like writing an essay or writing running an article of some type when there isn't even a project as part of the picture. It's just, this is kind of, these are my thoughts, or maybe speaking to an issue that you are passionate about or means a lot to you at the moment, is another sort of strategy that a firm might be able to invest in, right? In terms of that might be a focus of theirs. I've also found that, when in terms of getting a project like a residential project into a context where you don't normally see architecture necessarily. So let's say, for example, a house project featured on ABC Radio National, show. The story might actually be about something to do with people leaving the city because of coronavirus and going to, a regional area, relocating. There might be a bigger narrative that story kind of fits into. I sort of see that as like the real 4D chess next level kind of media strategy around architecture. How do you sort of think about that? If sometimes, when do you make that call that maybe the story of the project might be outside, external to the project? It might be something bigger. Like, is there any sort of thoughts on that?
I think it all comes naturally from, I think you can't be contrived about any of that stuff. It has to be part of the story.
Yep.
So what I would say there is you're really looking at stepping back from whatever it is that you're doing, whether it's your project or your practice generally, and just saying, what's interesting here to someone over here? So what's interesting to mainstream media about what it is that we're doing? There's a practice up in either country Victoria or New South Wales called Regional Design Services, I think they call it, or the Regional Design Service. And they're basically building this beautiful brand around the fact that they're offering regional architectural services, right? So there's an example of something that wasn't a media decision. They didn't go, we're going to move to the country so that we get media attention. They've gone, we're going to do this because it's something we believe in, and then we're going to talk about what it is that we do. It's as simple as that. I think being too strategic, particularly for architects, can be daunting, and it can feel, it can be not genuine, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
So I would always say, just look at the things that you love, the things that you're interested in, and see if there are opportunities there to talk to someone, anyone, everyone about that. So, that's a perfect example of this idea of there will already be projects underway where people are moving from cities because of COVID, and they're looking to invest. So what has come out of that is that instead of people buying a house that is incredibly expensive in the middle of the city, they're going to buy one that's much more affordable out in the country, and they're going to have money left over to hire architects. So those stories are going to be massive. They're going to be all over the place. And I'm sure there are already architects sitting there going, oh yeah, we've got clients that are looking to do that. Project isn't going to be completed for, 12, 24 months. Doesn't matter. That's one of those ones where you can go and find a newspaper journalist. Say, hey, we're doing this. We'd love to talk about it. And you can start that story before there's any project completed.
Yeah, and that is an interesting example, because I think it comes back to what you're saying earlier about talking about the brief, the challenges, and the solutions, right? And what a practice might overlook is the fact that the client maybe did come to them and say, hey, because of coronavirus, we are making this drastic, unexpected, never before considered the idea that we were going to move to a regional area and build a house on this amazing site and do these things. And that became so, maybe intertwined in the project and became part of the brief. But unless you're being really, unless you're actually focusing on making sure that you're actually communicating some of those facts and some of that information, that could just get completely missed by a journalist, right? If you were to just go, here are the pictures, we used this type of timber on the walls, and we used this kind of landscaping, hope you like the project, that might be completely missing some of the juicier or more interesting details of the project, right? So again, focusing on the client, and maybe not, I really like what you also said, Ben, it's almost sort of totally contradicting the way I was looking at it in terms of don't actually be too strategic, really just maybe give the information, and then whatever's there is there, kind of, in terms of how
I think that idea of a strategy, of having a strategy, I mean, the only thing that a strategy serves is implementation, right? Structured implementation. Everyone can have a strategy, and so many people are like, I'm going to hire someone to develop a strategy, and then they just don't commit. Excuse me. They don't commit to really implementing the strategy. And so I think and architects are notorious for this. The number of architects websites you go to and it says under construction, and it has done for the past 10
Since
years.
2016. Yeah.
Yeah, that's that same strategy thing. Until I have the perfect strategy, or until I've got everything perfect, I'm not going to do something. And if you start to pick your projects apart, even a project there might be projects where the finished product doesn't photograph well.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, it might be a public toilet that is just, a standard public toilet, but the way that you've implemented it, the scheme for it is actually really newsworthy. So I think pulling the projects apart and looking at those elements, and I think the brief challenges solutions thing is a great way to do that. When you go back to the brief, you remember what the client asked for, and then you look at the finished product and you go, that's why that is like that. That's why we have a round window, at the front of the house, whatever it is. And then you tell that story instead of just going, here's a house with a round window at the front. Like there's an actual story behind that, and you've forgotten it because, as you say, you've sort of gone through the pain of it and have forgotten it.
And the details are kind of what bring the project to life, right? Like in the story, it's those little connections that really is what architecture does so well, particularly in residential, when the client is such a larger than life figure in the design of the home, that those little things are sometimes what make the projects really, really interesting, really nice to learn about as well.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing we say to architects when you're preparing your content, even if you can't quote your clients, go back to your client and say, what space do you like the most? What on a Saturday morning, tell us what you do. Or if you're lucky enough to be able to go and observe them using a space, what is it that they love, and ask them about that. And it will reveal things that you didn't even know you were creating. So there's this great example we use in Between Architecture here in Melbourne, who is a practice who came on with us very early on. Nick, who is also a photographer, he went and photographed one of their projects, and he asked the clients, what do you like most? And the clients, they didn't talk about, circulation space or fenestration.
The fenestration, that's
one of my favorite terms. It's just a nice word. But the client said, you know what, our favorite thing is this step here. And Nick sort of said, oh, what do you mean? I said, with the old house, before the extension was put on, we used to sit on this step together and watch the kids play. And now that we have this extension here, we still do the same thing. We sit on this step and we look out and watch the kids play in the living area. And the beauty in that is that was a design decision that came out of the client telling that story to the architect, right? Yeah. So you're basically going, oh, okay, well, we'll keep that step down. That could have gone. That step could have been completely gone, but it was an important family ritual. Yeah. And when you do that one story alone, I mean, I'd call that something like the back step house or something like that, or the family step house. And that's where the real joy is. And if Nick hadn't have asked that question of the clients, that part of the story might not have been
lost.
So key. Yeah, it could be
and
lost.
And sometimes that can be a byproduct of how long it does take to eventually design and build a house, that you're like, oh, that was like 2 years ago we had that conversation.
Yeah, you forget it, but also, I mean, the nature of architecture is that there's a lot of challenges that go along with it, a lot of headaches, and you actually want to forget a lot of it. So you don't really want to think about the fact, that story of this family step. For the architects, they look at that step and they go, that caused me so many headaches.
Like,
if we'd have just gotten rid of that
family. Yeah, they're like so over it at the end, and then they're just like, I just want it out the door. But it's kind of like maybe going back, or even being, maybe that is again another argument for maybe focusing on like maybe being more thoughtful, or keeping that communication and media storytelling stuff maybe just in the back of your mind throughout, like, so you can just kind of maybe keep a Word document where you're just like jotting down little notes or observations to come back to, like that sort of stuff would
even
help
sketches
so much.
And things. Sketches, like a lot of architects are still doing sketches. If you're sketching that step, even with a little kid on there, keep that stuff. That's all really valuable to a story ultimately. And I use that example of maybe you would name that house something else. Yeah, that house is called something else because there was a clearer story, basically. Yeah. But looking at those things is how you name a project as well. And we talk about this in our podcast around how to name a project. But story is everything for architecture. It's the thing that makes your project unique, even if it's not instantly obvious why it's unique. that's how you find that unique component, which is of interest to journalists and editors
Love it.
and potential clients.
Yeah, absolutely. Ben, thank you so much for, agreeing to do this video and this conversation. I think there's so much information. I feel like you need to write a book on getting architecture, communicating architecture. I would definitely buy that. You and Nick have a seriously awesome podcast, kind of the Bowerbird podcast, and where episode by episode you guys kind of break down in like real practical, actionable kind of detail the process and benefits and all these amazing arguments for kind of getting published and how to do it. So I'll go ahead and promote that for you in terms of everybody who's watching who thought that, you know, some of Ben's insights really interesting and are looking to actually kind of go into that next layer of depth and sort of think about how you can apply some of that stuff to your practice. That podcast is definitely the thing to check out. So people could just basically search for Bowerbird podcast and they're guaranteed to find it.
Bowerbird podcast, yeah. Yep. Or go to bowerbird.io
and I think it's on the home. Yeah, it's on the home. Exactly. Send us a message and ask them to recommend a writer and a photographer and all that kind of stuff. Right, yeah. Then sign up. Awesome. Thank you very much, Ben. That was
awesome.
That was
great.
Thank you.
Always great to chat. All right. Thanks, Dave.
You too.